Okay, so we left off last time talking about Max Weber and the evolutionary perspective. He believed that social evolution was a generalized process that worked towards increasing rationalization as well as bureaucratization of the world as a whole, essentially capturing people in these iron cages of bureaucracy. This necessarily, of course, entailed the destruction of individual liberties. However, there was a way out of this iron cage for Max Weber, and this was through charismatic acts and charismatic individuals. They acted in opposition to overall rationalization and bureaucratization of the world as a whole, in that charismatic individuals were, in fact, able to break the bonds of routine and radically redirect society as a whole. For Max Weber, in much the same way that Karl Marx and Frederick Engels engage in conversations with Adam Smith, so too does Max Weber engage in conversations with Karl Marx. For Weber, Marx relied too heavily on economics and dialectical conflict between forces of production and relations of production as the motor driving social evolution. And indeed, uh, in the context of Marxist analysis, it was the relations of production around the particular mode of production. And in the capitalist mode of production, under Marx's layout of these different modes of production, he establishes three main characteristics of the capitalist system. First, that the means of production are in fact owned exclusively by the owners, by the bourgeoisie. The workers, the proletariat, are in essence forced to sell their labor. This is part two. They're forced to sell their labor uh, as this is the only thing that they actually have and the only way that they can make their way in the world. And it's important to keep in mind that when Marx is writing, he's talking about processes of urbanization, the movement of individuals from rural areas and agrarian lifestyles to more urban environments where really the only thing that they do have is their labor and deploying that labor because they have lost interest in or their land, either actually lost ownership of that land or been forced to sell. The market hasn't allowed for continued production at that scale. So you see migration into cities. And finally, the third component of the capitalist mode of production is that any sort of profits are not equally distributed throughout society or throughout individuals for both the workers and the owners, but rather taken by the owners to reinvest in the means of production and increase profit overall. So in this system, Marx sees this as fundamentally flawed, and he sees the ultimate movement towards progress as a whole within society, a shift really from an evolutionary perspective from capitalism to eventually a communist state where the relations of production are more just in Marx and Engels' estimation. But again, capitalism becomes a prerequisite for communism under Marx's scheme. For Weber, Marx relied too heavily on economics and, again, in dialectical forces, as I mentioned. Weber focused on the ownership of property as the constitutive element of class. However, class alone does not necessarily have analytic primacy. He noted that there were other elements of identity that may be of equal or greater importance, and this is apparent in his essay on class, status, and party. Again, a status and party become important uh, in terms of analysis of conflict overall within society. He was, however, in agreement with Marx in that ideology was masking the true nature of relations between people. In order for class action to take place, class consciousness must already exist. Various ideological structures may be present that prevent classes from being aware of their true nature, the true nature of their oppression, and hence prevent the formation of class consciousness. And this is what Marx has referred to as false consciousness, wherein individuals are unaware of their own ideological indoctrination. And recently, there has been some criticism of this in anthropology, noting that, in fact, you have individuals that are aware of their own ideological indoctrination, that they're not passive dupes overall. Weber was very influential in anthropology, particularly for interpretive and postmodern anthropology. His notion of overlapping identifications or identities, what in terms of class, status, and party, these three overlapping identifications, is really a prelude, and quite complex for the time, but it's a prelude to later work of interpretive and postmodern anthropologists who borrow from this idea and build on it, the notion of overlapping identifications, that there are forces that cut across class identification and compete with it for prominence in social action, status, and party. Class, status, and party were overlapping identifications, so that one doesn't necessarily necessitate the other, or one doesn't dominate the other. And identification with one or the other is in fact dependent upon circumstances. And again, we see this in the context of different social constructions of race. Lancaster's work, for example, in Nicaragua, where he talks about overlapping racial identifications of Nicaraguans, and their different three different color classificatory systems, which are deployed in strategic fashion depending on who is present in the room. And so, although in Nicaragua, whiteness is something which is held up or desired, individuals' claims to whiteness will come and go depending on who else is present during the conversation. So this is very not only overlapping identities, but also situational identities. So this gives you a sense of how Weber's work and ideas have spun out over time. He was also influential for the Boasians, or the American anthropology of the early 20th century, noting the importance of the individual, that the actual unfolding of history was predicated on individual action and not law. And so much as Franz Boas was against a science of culture as senseless, so too was Max Weber. So I hope to have given you guys a good sense of some of the different social theorists, sociological theorists that have actually, as well as psychological theorists that have informed much of what was to come in anthropology over the next decades and even over the next century as a whole.